So, okay, thank you, Natalia. So this event is being recorded, just this part of the conversation in which we'll be all together in the same room. In a minute, later on, we're going to go to breakout rooms, and then the conversations will be more private and so on. I'm going to share a little bit with you my screen, just a second. So, oops. Can you see it now? Great. Great. So, well, thanks for coming here. I think the first thing I wanted to say is that this event is actually designed and meant for signatories of all commitments of the Philanthropy for Climate movement. So most of you maybe don't know each other yet. Most of you are probably already engaged somehow with the WINGS community or with the climate implementation series. And we wanted to organize these webinars to actually give you one extra hand in terms of getting new ideas, new inspirations on how you can implement the commitments that you have made. So this is the second webinar, the second of a series of 7. We are going to cover from now until the end of the year all 7 pillars of the commitment, and each of them we are actually bringing different knowledge partners, different inputs that could be useful for you, regardless if you are just starting a journey or if you are very advanced. We are going to be guided mostly by Yasmin today, but I just wanted to give you, although you are all signatories, just to give you a bit of an overview of where we are in terms of the movement and where we are in terms of what's this vision that we see going forward. So, oops, just a second. So what is the Philanthropy for Climate movement today? I think it's pretty small here. So now we have more than 570 foundations. Many of those, you guys are one of those, that have committed to sign one of the national or the international philanthropy commitments. We are spread across 18 countries. And this is growing mostly in different parts of the global south and places where WINGS has been doing a lot of work to engage its own members and bring new foundations to this bigger effort. So I wanted to recall that the International Philanthropy Commitment is a call to all foundations, regardless of the mission, status, or geographic location, to come together and signal their commitment. So sometimes we see some questions by foundations that are, I'm not a climate funder, I'm not very into climate, I'm not so knowledgeable about climate action. Should I still sign? Should I still be part of this movement? And the answer is yes. This is precisely the effort is also to bring those new players and new organizations that are in different stages to this bigger space. As you may recall, the commitment involves 7 pillars of action. So from education to transparency, today we are discussing precisely resources, and we understand that different foundations are in different moments of this journey of implementation, their commitments. And we want to address them in detail. What would it look like to be in these different levels, and be very frank and honest, and be okay with the fact that sometimes you can advance much more in one pillar than the other. Sometimes some can make a lot of sense to your own operations, and others don't. So this is part of the movement. This is welcome, and we are here actually to bring ideas to advance in whatever it makes more sense to each of you. We know that this journey is a bit challenging, and because of that, we are trying, and this is a very experimental effort, different resources that could be useful for you. So we launched the implementation guide a couple of months ago, in which we are using a lot of those commands or those ideas for these webinars. We are doing these webinars as of today, as you can see, so it's another opportunity for learning and interaction. We are developing the ideas of having peer exchanges directly between funders as they bring us this demand. We are hosting public events at international and regional forums, such as COP27 and others. And in our website, we are constantly uploading different knowledge products, case studies, and resources that could be useful for you. So my last message before we go and before we pass on to Jasmine is that the commitment is a starting point of a longer journey. And this commitment is not those kind of efforts that you just, once you sign and you commit and then it's gone. We are not bringing you back or asking you what you are doing. We want to support you in this journey, and we understand that it's important to see it as a journey and not as one standalone moment. So, and that's our effort. We are very open to suggestions, requests, anything that you feel that could be useful for you to embrace the climate journey. Please go ahead and reach out to us afterwards. I will stop here and pass it on to Jasmine.
Thank you, Alice, for that introduction. And hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, I guess good evening for some of you. So my name's Yasmin and I'm the co-managing director of Impatience Earth. You may have seen a brochure that was sent out last week by the Wings team, but in summary, we are a pro bono advisory service that helps donors who are new to climate to help gain courage, confidence, and the tools to make an impact in the climate space. And we do this by taking donors on a learning journey where they can understand how climate aligns with their own values and to develop impactful strategies and basically start committing resources into the sector. I will chat about that a bit more in detail when I do my presentation, but I would like to first show you a video by my friend and colleague, Sophie Marple. And Sophie Marple, she actually had a hand in starting Impatience Earth, and she's done so from her experience of actually starting in climate and having that question of like, how do I start? You know, I've learned that this is a big issue, but I don't know how to start. And she knew that there was that need to help other donors answer that question. So you'll hear her in her own words. So if I can ask Natalia to please play the video for us.
My name is Sophie Marple and I'm a founding trustee of Gower Street. At Gower Street, we've been funding climate work for about 4 years now. When we decided to pivot a majority portion of our resources to tackling climate change, we did so because we've become increasingly aware of the urgency of the situation and also about the pitifully small amount of funding that was going into the sector. At this point, 4 years ago, we had already started our trust 10 years earlier and we were funding solely in education. And so we were already quite informed and experienced funders. So the approach we took to funding in climate was to learn as we go. We started making small grants straight away. We joined the Environmental Funders Network and that brought us into a network of very engaged funders. And we learned quickly to ask questions and find out what other people were doing in the space and what was working and what wasn't. The support of the FN team and members have been absolutely invaluable on our journey to becoming the funders that we are today. In terms of the small grants, we started funding some direct action work because that's actually what we could see was happening and having an effect. So in fact, our first proper grant was to Extinction Rebellion to help them prepare for the April 2019 rebellion. And we also made use of the Rapid Response Fund, which is hosted by the Environmental Funders Network. This was particularly helpful because we could commit small amounts of money to lots of different organisations who had very time-sensitive, specific pieces of work they wanted to do with the money. And it also meant that we took a bit of a scattergun approach, so we got to meet lots of different organisations doing different things, and it helped us get a good overview of the sector quite quickly by funding in this way. In terms of challenges, it is a really overwhelming sector and there's so much that needs funding. So it's been a challenge for us as a relatively small organisation, small funder, to work out where we can have the most impact. But what over time we've realised is that our sweet spot is funding small organisations doing transformatory pieces of work, and they may be sort of launching a pilot or doing some scoping work, and they're kind of building a model so that then they can take it to bigger funders once it's been proved, and then they can help support them with bigger injections of capital so that then the organisation can grow. We believe that if organisations are already receiving large injections of capital from big funders, we tend to say that we're not the right funder for them. So then we tend not to fund them. However, we're flexible and we need to. For example, at the moment, a number of the large funders are sort of doing strategic reviews, and they've stopped putting money into the sector. Hopefully it will start again soon, but this has been a real challenge for everybody in the sector. And we're finding people with organisations with much bigger budgets than we would normally expect coming to us asking for funding and needing it because they can't get the funding elsewhere. So in positions like this, we have actually decided we flex so that we have funded some bigger organisations at this quite critical time. In terms of my advice for funders in the sector, first I would say if you're new into the sector, join a network, something like EFN. It makes and then make the most of the appetite for collaboration amongst the funders that are members. Seek advice from them, find out who's been around for a while, find out what they've been doing, what they've learned, what's worked, what hasn't. Secondly, I really believe that it's important to invest in support. For the first 3 years of us funding in this sector, it was just my husband and I with the founding trustees of Gower Street. Plus, we had a bit of admin support just 1 day a week. And it was hard going. It was hard making the grants. It was hard to know whether we were doing the right thing at the right time. And we just weren't funding as well or as impactfully or as much as we could have been. And so last year we brought in 2 members of staff. They're a job share. They're absolutely brilliant, and they have completely upped our game. We now ask better questions. We have a much better process, which is sort of based on trust. We are learning a lot more, and I am enjoying it much more. And we are crucially getting much more money out of the door. And finally, you should think about the quantities of capital you have available to put into the sector, and always be thinking, can I fund more? Can you front load your funding or for your spending, or could you spend down? We decided about 2 years ago to spend down because we had a fund of about 10 million, and we decided that this is the critical decade and we were going to make most impact if we put that into the sector now. So that's what we've decided to do. Is that something you could consider doing? Because right now, every pound you put in now is worth far more than in 10 years' time when we have started reaching tipping points, and there's so much less we can do, particularly in terms of mitigation. So good luck with it, and I hope our paths will cross sometime during your funding journey.
Wonderful, thank you. So I hope that video gave you some inspiration as we kick off this interactive session. And this session is designed to get you to a place where you feel like you can go further in committing resources into the climate sector. I actually wanted to ask a quick question before we start a presentation. So I'm just going to remove my spotlight so I can see everybody. I mean, everyone here on this webinar has already committed some resource into the sector, and you're doing so right now by dedicating your time. And I just wanted to ask, who has already committed funding into the sector? Yeah, I see a hand. If you're not on video, you can actually put a hand. Yep, I see a hand, Lindy. Thank you. Okay, so we do have a couple of, great. Yes, we do have a few here who are moving along into the resources, into putting more resources into the sector. And we hope to learn from you, I think, through this session. So thank you. Natalia, if you can bring up my presentation, and then we'll start with that. So thank you. It's great to see more raised hands. Right, so I'm just going to make a short presentation using the text and the structure of the commitment. And through this, I'll be sharing some insights that we've learned from working with new climate donors over the past 2 years. So just to recap, this is the main text of Pillar 2 of the commitment. And so it's recognizing the urgency of the situation. We commit resources to accelerate work that addresses the root causes of climate change or adaptation to its impacts. If our governing document or other factors make it difficult to directly fund such work, we will find other ways to contribute or consider how such barriers might be overcome. And later in this session, we will be discussing some of those barriers. Next slide, please, Natalia. So as the commitment is structured, so each pillar has different levels. So you're getting started, and then you're building momentum, and finally you're showing leadership. And what I would say in the phase of getting started is that you should be brave. Climate requires courage and hope from all of us. And it can seem like such a huge and complex problem, but we just need to take one step and then another step and another step. And that way you can make incredible impact, and collectively we can do a lot. And you just need to start. We've seen clients who have worked with us who have gone through quite intense learning journeys and then actually get stuck at the point of committing resources. And this is partly because perhaps the program officers who've been working with us, they haven't been given enough power to make decisions, or there hasn't been enough internal capacity, or the principal decision maker hasn't been involved, and therefore they aren't as convinced as to the need to commit resources. So if you can get all of these in place in terms of your internal capacity and decision making, then you will set yourself up for long-term success. And I would say just start with making one grant. You know, don't get stuck in analysis paralysis, which is so easy to do with a subject like climate change. You know, it can be to a re-granting organization, or it can be to an organization that works at the intersection of what you already fund. And that can just make it easier. And that's part of your learning as well. And it might not be what you end up funding long-term, but it helps to start that momentum, which is just so key. Okay, next slide, please. And then once you've done that initial work internally and, you know, starting with your first grants, the next phase is building on that momentum. And what I would say here is that it's really good to be clear on your goals. And now's the time to start becoming a bit more strategic. And we have found that clients who can be clear on how much they spend, on how much they can spend during a certain time frame, are able to make grants much more quickly and much more effectively because they're aligned on a very clear goal. So yes, do allocate a proportion of funding, but do have a time frame around that. You know, is it going to be $1 million over 2 years? You know, is it going to be 100,000 over the next year? Something that just gives you something to work towards is very helpful. And also during this stage, you really want to increase the size of your grant making. You know, once you've done that initial learning, I think you can scale that, and you can still continue experimenting. And here you know, as part of your learning, you will learn what the impact is of your grant making and how to extend that impact. The other thing here is to actually be collaborative and be part of a community. So as Sophie said in her video, she started by actually joining a community. So she mentioned the Environmental Funders Network, which is based here in the UK. And that's a very active community of environmental funders who are constantly learning from each other, constantly challenging each other. And that's, you know, that's very helpful when you're starting out. And be collaborative. There are so many options for funding with other funders, and also sharing what you're learning and asking for insights and learnings from other funders as well. So continue to reach out. It's a very open and friendly community, and there's so much out there in terms of support and resource. Okay, next slide. I'm just going to turn the light on in here. Okay, and then level 3. So this is where you really go deep, and you're going to need to deepen and expand your internal capacity. Ultimately, at this stage, when you are showing leadership, you want to show that you are putting a lot of resource into the sector and that you understand the need to spend down, or if not spend down, then at least commit quite significant resource, with the understanding that the more that you put in now, the more return, the more impact you can make on that, as Sophie said in her message to you. And the more that you spend, the more capacity that you actually need. It's hard to get grants out of the door if you're making, if you have a commitment of a couple of million, a year. So build the capacity as per, the level that you're putting into the sector. Don't just put it on one person. We have found in several cases where one individual is responsible for a massive budget, and ultimately that delays grants into the sector. So don't forget to actually invest resource into your own capacity. And yes, I've put spend down here because yes, there's no point in having a large endowment if the world is in climate chaos, unfortunately. So the more you can invest upfront, the better for all of us. I think, okay, next slide, Natalia. And as you go about this, think about how you fund. We've heard from the sector that in addition to increasing the amount of funding going into climate, how you fund is just as important, so the quality of that funding. And that means that you need to build trust with grantees, and it means funding longer term, if you can, funding unrestricted grants, not putting so much emphasis on onerous reporting. So as much as you can, try to put yourself in the grantees' shoes. Often a lot of emphasis goes on monitoring and evaluation, and that takes a lot of resource from the grantee itself, and that takes away from the work that they are doing. So do think more about like what are the actual grant making practices that you hold as an organization. The second thing is about where the resources need to go. So another part of thinking around the quality of your climate philanthropy is to direct it direct it to where it needs to go. And from what we've seen from the sector, it is largely to the global south. It is largely to organizations working with a climate justice lens, and it's small organizations. You will have huge impact by funding in those areas, but unfortunately, these sectors are still very much overlooked and underfunded. And because of that, that's an opportunity for you, because it means that if you are giving money to that, if you're giving money to those people who are otherwise unfunded, like you will make huge impact, even with just $5,000, $10,000. The third thing is what works best for you. So as Sophie mentioned, she realized that like she's a relatively small funder and there are large climate funders around her. So she funds in a niche that works for her. She doesn't need to replicate what big climate funders are doing. And neither do you. So think about what works for you. What are your values? How will you ensure that this is a long-term thing for you? How will you make it sustainable? If you're not following your passions, then ultimately, like it's not sustainable. The next thing is integrating learning as you go. Learning is a huge part of this journey. And actually, we advise people to do learning before you commit substantially into the sector, because the more that you learn, the more strategic you can be, the more long-term you can be, and you'll just understand solution areas so much better and what needs to happen. So do integrate learning as you go, and yeah, as you make your grants, feed that back into your grant making. Like, what have you learned? What does that mean in terms of your future plans? And then the final thing is obviously funding at the intersection of your existing portfolios. If it is difficult to fund, if it's difficult to convince your board to fund climate as a distinct stream of funding or as a specific part of your portfolio, then there are so many options to fund at the intersection of what you're already doing. So if you're funding women's rights, there's so much in terms of women and climate. If you're funding livelihoods, there's so much, it could be around, just transition, or it could be around, regenerative agriculture. There's so many ideas there. So do that exploring and see what works for you. Okay, next slide. Natalia? Okay. And then to give you some very specific ideas, as I just said, there are so many intersections, and one great thing is that there are these bodies that are already existing, which help you just make that start, and that do so much of the work for you in the sense of doing the due diligence, identifying the actors who are like making an impact in the field. And they can reach communities and organizations that for many of us is just too difficult to do. So there are these regranters, there are these pooled funds that exist to help funders go reach those communities on the ground. And I've just listed a few here. But if you're interested in agriculture, have a look at the Agroecology Fund, which is a pooled fund. If you're interested in climate litigation as a lever, have a look at the Foundation for International Law for Environment. If you're interested in land rights, then look at CLUA. And if you're interested in movements, look at the Urban Movement on Innovation Fund. It's almost like there's something for everybody and for every intersection. And all you need to do is basically, reach out to them because they're there, and they're there to answer questions as well. Okay, next slide. And make the use of resources that already exist. There's so much in the sector, and so much of this is actually supported by existing climate funders, because climate funders, the ones who've been around for a while, they know that actually new donors, they need this support. So they've put a lot of resource back into the sector to help new donors to then join them. And so there are lots of resources available. There is the Climate Justice and Just Transition Collaborative, for example, which is building a donor community around climate justice and just transition. And they are launching a compendium of climate justice and global south organizations, which will be a huge tool for funders looking to support smaller grassroots organizations in the global south. There's Active Philanthropy, which works very similarly to Impatience Earth and has a great online resource hub. So if you're interested in funding a certain lever or sector, go have a look at their resource hub and they'll have suggestions for you. There's us, we provide our services for free, basically to help get commitments into the sector and help get grants out of the door. There's the Environmental Funders Network, as already mentioned, which is a fantastic community. I'm sure there are other national networks that do similar work. And obviously Wings and Philea, if you're in Europe, there's just so much out there. So, be part of these communities. You're already part of this Wings community. Continue to take advantage of these resources because there's so much out there. And it makes you feel like you're part of something bigger, which you are. And that's so important, I think, as you're doing this work, to not feel like you're alone. Okay, next slide. That's it. So any questions coming out from that? Okay. No questions? Okay, great. In which case, I think we are due for an exercise. So the brilliant Natalia will wave her magic wand and put you into groups. And in these groups, we will be answering these questions. So where do you think you are as an organization in implementing this pillar? So we've said level 1, 2, or 3. So as a reminder, level 1 is getting started, level 2 is building momentum, and 3 is showing leadership. And if you share with your group, what has been your experience in implementing it so far? What's worked well and what hasn't? And then lastly, what challenges are you facing now and how can you overcome them? So those are the questions that we'll be discussing in groups for the next half hour. And then we'll come back out and we'll invite you to share some of your key takeaways, you know, any reflections, anything that you've learned that you would like to share with the group. So Natalia, if you can do the magic and send us off into groups, please.